Joining us once again, Gideon Rose, managing editor of Foreign Affairs magazine, and David Andelman, former foreign correspondent for the New York Times and CBS News, and now editor of World Policy Journal. Welcome to the two of you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Let's start with Afghanistan, the policy review. Should we send more troops, and if so, how many? We already know that the general in charge there has asked for 40,000 U.S. troops. The vice president doesn't like that idea, something far less. And then we have Democratic Senator Carl Levin, who now he's chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. He's proposing that we send a lot more troops to train up the Afghans. Vietnamization, that's the word that comes back to me. And Gideon, we talk about this contrasting and comparison of those two wars, but is this a good idea?
Well, I mean, training is absolutely a good idea, and it's going to be part of the answer because this is an ongoing problem, and at the end of the day, if there is an end of the day that's stable, the Afghan government is going to be able to control its own territory with its own troops.
But so do you have the time to do this?
Well, you need to do that alongside. I think it's a mistake to think of these as alternate options, because there are jobs that we can do ourselves and that only the U.S. can do at this point, while at the same time we need to train the Afghan forces and build them up so that they can eventually take over from us. So you have to do what we need to do now while at the same time training somebody else to do it so we can hand off to them later on.
David, is this a compromise, though? I mean, is this essentially the Obama administration saying we really don't want to send a lot more troops?
Oh, it is certainly a compromise. There's no question about that. But the problem is it also takes the focus away from the other key priority, and that is building a civilian infrastructure there that really works. What we really need to do is to focus on the countryside, to focus on squeezing corruption out of the countryside, out of the government, and so on. And I'm not sure that even adding, training troops, we tried that not only in Cambodia and Vietnam, which I saw firsthand, but in Iraq. And that didn't seem to work all that well. Eventually, we had to withdraw to the caserns in Iraq, and we'll probably have to do the same in Afghanistan if we don't worry about the civilian base.
Well, let's talk about the civilian government. There's going to be a runoff election. The New York Times is now saying that seems pretty certain. Isn't this just the United States has forced this issue so much that we're demanding there be a runoff to legitimize the Karzai government?
To a certain extent, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong, because there's no question in most people's minds that Karzai stole the lead. So forcing a runoff is, even if it's done at our behest, is actually in the service of getting a more legitimate outcome. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Stole the lead. I like it. Okay, you're going way out there.
It's true. I mean, there's no question. The election was stolen in so many ways. It's just an example of how corrupt this government is from top to bottom, and we have to try to figure a way of squeezing some of that out if we're really going to make progress there.
Okay, well, let's move on to Pakistan, right next door. Escalating violence this week, and now reports that you have the Taliban, you have Al-Qaeda, and Punjabi militants all coming together as a critical force against the government. My question is, are they trying to change government policy in Pakistan, or are these groups wanting to take over?
Oh, well, they'd certainly like in some fashion to take over. What they really want to take over, in my view, and that is why Pakistan is the single most strategically critical part of the world right now. Afghanistan, leave that aside. Pakistan is where we should be focusing our attention. That's the war now, because they have nuclear weapons. The Taliban, Al-Qaeda, they get a hold of 2 nuclear weapons from the Pakistani arsenal. It's game over. There's no question. So we really do have to worry very seriously about that. And what they want is they're looking at that nuclear arsenal. They're also looking at the ability to function freely in places like South Waziristan without government interference. Those are their top 2 priorities, in my view.
I'll go out on a limb here and say I think these actual recent attacks are a good thing. And you say, well, how can that possibly be? Because they are a sign of the militants overplaying their hand. Everybody I talk to who knows the most about the situation says the Pakistani army retains its ability to control these groups, is in control of the country, and is callously and cynically using them for its own purposes vis-a-vis India, Afghanistan, and so forth. And the Pakistani army has to be convinced to shut these guys down. And by having the militants actually attack the army and the government and official headquarters, it basically is a step towards getting the Army to recognize that this is their problem, not just our problem. And it ties into this question about the civilian aid package that we've just given and the conditions on it, which the Army is resisting. It wants lots of money and support and absolutely no strings attached. And we want them to actually do things that are in our interest and their own interest. And these attacks could help convince them to do what we want.
Gideon, with all due respect, you could have said the same thing actually about the roadside bomb attacks in Iraq, and it didn't work that way. I mean, this is something that is very critical, and we are going to have to convince the Pakistanis to deal with it.
All right. Well, speaking of nukes, I want to turn to Iran, because this is a nation obviously trying to acquire nuclear power. The United States wants to impose tougher sanctions. This week we had Russia and then we've had China. Both have come out and said that they really don't see sanctions as the way to go. My question is then, where does the U.S. effort to try to impose tougher sanctions stand if you don't have China and Russia on board?
Well, what's very interesting this week, I think, is Putin and the Chinese leadership getting together and talking among themselves. Remember, Putin was on a visit to China. This was a very important visit, I think. It was right after that all of a sudden the so-called condominium that the West thought, the United States thought they'd arranged, kind of fell apart. I think what they got together and said was, look, we each have our stakes there. Let's just kind of slow things down a little bit and see what happens. I'm not persuaded that they won't ultimately, if the Iranians really move resolutely towards a bomb, won't ultimately come in and say, all right, we're going to really have to do whatever we can. Neither one of them really wants to have Iran with a nuclear weapon.
Go along with that?
Welcome to life in the post-American world. It's they have more autonomy to buck our wishes. We're able to do what we want to do, but if you want to bring other countries along, and these days economically for sanctions you need to, we're going to have to basically either have a really clear-cut case or be willing to give up on other things that they want.
Gideon Rose, David Andelman, a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.